Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943, 600 hours. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding the Lee resupply convoy, stood with a growing, nervous confidence on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shiryuki. Before him, 8 destroyers shepherded 8 fully loaded transport ships through the deep blue waters of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese naval doctrine, forged in the victories of the past year, dictated that these waters belonged to the Empire. The convoy carried the 51st Division's desperately needed reinforcements, 900 soldiers plus thousands of tons of critical supplies, who had been promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Lee, New Guinea. Kimura had every reason to believe in their safe arrival. For over a year, Japanese warships had sailed this route with only token resistance from American surface forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy's confidence stemmed from its experience. The devastating successes at Pearl Harbor and the Java Sea, the seemingly endless inability of high-altitude American bombers to score direct hits on moving ships, and the belief that the concentrated anti-aircraft fire from his destroyers could effortlessly tear apart any low-flying aircraft foolish enough to approach within range. Captain Tamachihara, commanding the destroyer Shikanami, had sailed these waters between Rabaul and Lee multiple times. He knew the Allies had tried everything: high-altitude bombing from B-17 flying fortresses that rarely hit anything and were easily tracked, risky torpedo attacks that required long, straight approaches, turning the attacking aircraft into slow, perfect targets, and medium-altitude bombing that gave ships plenty of time to maneuver away from falling ordnance. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed specific, effective tactics for these aerial threats: rapid, simultaneous evasive maneuvers, disciplined and concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships to create a dense flak barrier, and reliable fighter cover provided by the 11th Air Fleet based at Rabaul. These tactics had worked so well that Admiral Gunishi Mikawa had approved this convoy despite knowing, from decrypts and reconnaissance, that the Americans would certainly detect it. Japanese naval officers understood aerial warfare differently than their American counterparts. They viewed it primarily as a battle between ships and horizontal bombers or torpedo planes, encounters where disciplined anti-aircraft fire and sharp maneuvering could defeat most attacks. They had not yet grasped the American focus on tactical air superiority as a commerce-destroying doctrine. Commander Yasumi Doi, aboard the destroyer Takatsukaze, translated as favorable wind, had drilled his gun crews relentlessly, teaching them to concentrate their 25 cannons on approaching aircraft, to lead their targets properly based on speed and range, and to maintain steady fire even when under the extreme pressure of an attack. The convoy's anti-aircraft defenses were formidable: more than 125 cannons, dozens of 13 machine guns, and the heavy 5-inch dual-purpose guns of the destroyers. They created what Japanese doctrine proudly called an umbrella of steel over the ships. These defenses had been proven effective against conventional attacks, shooting down or driving off American bombers on numerous occasions, giving the Japanese the fatal confidence that they could handle whatever the Allies threw at them this time. The transport ships themselves, including the largest, Ogawa Maru, displacing over 6,400 tons and carrying an entire regiment of the 51st Division, were weighted down with vital cargo: ammunition, medical supplies, food, and heavy engineering equipment that the Japanese forces at Lee desperately needed to maintain their position in New Guinea. The men, who had been waiting at Rabaul for weeks, had been briefed that they were sailing into a combat zone where American aircraft were active, but they were reassured that Japanese naval superiority would protect them during the relatively short voyage to Lee. The convoy maintained a precise, drilled formation, with destroyers meticulously screening the transports, following procedures refined through 2 years of war. What Admiral Kimura and his officers could not possibly know, what no Japanese naval officer could imagine in their darkest nightmares, was that American mechanics in Australian workshops had transformed medium bombers into a weapon that would make these waters a killing field. Within 4 hours, these modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, with 8.50 caliber machine guns protruding from their noses like the fangs of some mechanical demon, would turn his magnificent convoy into a scattered trail of burning wreckage across the Bismarck Sea. The innovation, birth of the strafer gunship. The modification of B-25 Mitchell bombers into strafer gunships represents one of the most significant and least anticipated tactical innovations of the Pacific War. It was born from pure frustration with the ineffectiveness of conventional bombing against ships. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, known universally as Pappy, a former Navy enlisted pilot turned Army Air Forces officer, recognized the fundamental tactical error. Hitting moving ships from high altitude was nearly impossible. Furthermore, torpedo attacks required specialized training and heavy ordnance the Army Air Forces did not possess in the Southwest Pacific. Working with North American Aviation Field Representative Jack Fox at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, Gunn began his ingenious, unauthorized tinkering. He started by removing the glass bombardier position in the nose of the B-25, creating space for 4 fixed, forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Through rapid trial and error, this was quickly expanded to 8 guns in later modifications, with 4 in the nose and 2 external blister packs on each side of the forward fuselage. The work was demanding, requiring extensive reinforcement of the aircraft's nose structure, creative engineering for ammunition storage, and careful redistribution of weight to keep the aircraft balanced for low-level flight. Challenges Gunn and his dedicated mechanics solved with grit and ingenuity. The .50 caliber machine guns chosen were not standard. They fired the M8 armor-piercing incendiary (API) round, a 619-grain projectile that traveled at a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. This round was capable of penetrating the deck armor of destroyers and, crucially, setting intense fires with its incendiary component. Each gun could fire approximately 850 rounds per minute, meaning 8 guns firing together unleashed 6,800 rounds per minute. A solid, terrifying stream of destruction that could literally saw through a ship's superstructure, obliterate anti-aircraft positions, and kill exposed crew members before they could even adjust their aim. The psychological effect of facing this weapon was as devastating as its physical destruction. Japanese sailors who survived these attacks would later describe the sheer terror of seeing a B-25's nose ignite with muzzle flashes, knowing that hundreds of heavy, armor-piercing rounds were about to tear through their ship's thin bulkheads. This strafer modification was perfectly complemented by skip bombing tactics, pioneered by Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group using B-17s. Benn had discovered that bombs dropped from an altitude of 200 to 250 feet above the water, with the correct speed and trajectory, would skip like stones, bouncing into the sides of ships or exploding close enough to cause fatal, underwater damage. The technique required precise timing and incredible courage, as pilots had to fly straight and level toward their targets at maximum speed and minimum altitude, making themselves perfect targets for any surviving anti-aircraft fire. To achieve the necessary precision, pilots practiced endlessly against the wreck of the SS Pruth on a reef near Port Moresby, learning to judge distance, airspeed, and release points until they could consistently skip bombs into the target's hull. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, recognized the combined genius of the strafer modification and skip bombing. He called these B-25s his commerce destroyers, a perfect weapon to devastate Japanese shipping. By March 1943, the 3rd Attack Group, with the 90th Bombardment Squadron commanded by Major Edward Larner leading the way, had fully converted to the strafer configuration and developed attack tactics that maximized the 8-gun nose. The standard attack profile was simple but deadly. B-25s would approach at 1,000 to 1,500 feet, then drop sharply to wave-top height, often just 50 feet, about 2 miles from the target, accelerating to their maximum speed. At about 1,500 yards, the pilot would open fire with all 8 nose guns, hosing the target with API rounds while maintaining the approach for the skip bombing run. The massacre begins. The first indication Admiral Kimura had that something unprecedented was about to happen came shortly after 10:00 a.m., when lookouts spotted the first American aircraft approaching from the south. Lieutenant Commander Akata aboard the destroyer Asashio reported multiple contacts at medium altitude. What appeared to be a standard, expected American bombing formation of B-17s and B-25s approaching at around 7,000 feet. Exactly the kind of attack the convoy had prepared for. The Japanese gun crews reacted flawlessly as trained, swinging their weapons toward the approaching silver bombers, calculating deflection and altitude, preparing to throw up the curtain of anti-aircraft fire that had protected so many convoys before. Their disciplined action created the intended diversion for the true threat. While every Japanese eye watched the high-altitude bombers, while every gun barrel pointed skyward, 13 Royal Australian Air Force RAAF Beaufighters and 12 B-25 Mitchell strafers of the 3rd Attack Group came in at wave-top height from the southwest. They approached so low that their propeller wash created a frothy spray pattern on the ocean surface, masking their approach against the water's reflection. Major Edward Larner led the B-25 attack in his Mitchell, nicknamed Ruthless. As he bore down on the destroyer Shiryuki at a closing speed of over 280 mph, he could see Japanese sailors on deck pointing at his aircraft in a mixture of shock and confusion. They had seen B-25s before, but never configured like this. Never with 8 black holes in the nose where machine guns protruded like accusatory fingers. Never approaching at an altitude where the pilot could see individual, terrified faces on the ship's deck. Larner waited until he was just 1,200 yards from Shiryuki before squeezing his trigger. Instantly, 8 streams of .50 caliber death reached out toward the Japanese destroyer, the tracer rounds creating solid lines of light between aircraft and ship. The effect on Shiryuki was instantaneous and catastrophic. Hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into her bridge and superstructure at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The bridge windows exploded in showers of glass and steel fragments that shredded anyone standing nearby. The thin armor of the gun shields provided absolutely no protection against the .50 caliber rounds, which punched through steel like paper. Within seconds, the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns fell silent as their crews were literally torn apart by the concentrated, continuous fire. A Japanese ensign named Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors from Shiryuki's bridge, would later describe the attack as like being caught in a giant metal-cutting saw, watching his captain, and most of the bridge crew cut down in seconds by rounds that sparked and flashed as they tore through steel bulkheads. Larner maintained his 8-second firing run, pouring over 900 rounds into Shiryuki before releasing 2 500 lb bombs. The bombs skipped across the water like polished stones, slamming into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The 5-second delay fuses ensured the bombs penetrated deep into Shiryuki's hull before detonating. The resulting explosions broke the destroyer's back and opened massive, unmanageable holes that flooded her engine rooms within minutes. As Larner pulled up and away, his top turret gunner sprayed the deck with his own .50 calibers. Shiryuki was already listing heavily to port, her crew abandoning their guns to fight flooding that could not be controlled. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25s were selecting targets among the convoy, their pilots amazed at how the Japanese ship seemed paralyzed by this unprecedented form of attack. Lieutenant John Henibrian the Hag targeted the transport Kyokusei Maru, walking his 8-gun burst from bow to stern. He watched his tracers punch through the ship's bridge, demolish her forward cargo handling equipment, and silence her anti-aircraft positions before his skip bombs tore into her hull. The transport's captain, trying to maneuver away from the attack, found his helm unresponsive because the helmsman and most of the bridge crew were dead, cut down by .50 caliber rounds that had turned the bridge into a charnel house of shattered bodies and twisted metal. The RAAF Beaufighters, flying just above the waves, added to the carnage. Their 420 cannons and 6.303 caliber machine guns focused on anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews, suppressing any attempt at organized defense. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, flying a Beaufighter of No. 30 Squadron, described watching a ship's bridge literally disintegrate under the impact of his 20 explosive rounds, seeing Japanese sailors thrown into the air by secondary explosions, and watching wooden lifeboats shatter into kindling. The skip bombing proved devastatingly effective. The transport Tamemaru took 3 skip bomb hits in rapid succession. The explosions opened her hull like a tin can, instantly flooding her holds where hundreds of soldiers were packed into spaces meant for cargo. The soldiers, wearing full combat gear, had no chance of escaping the rapidly flooding compartments. Witnesses described hearing their screams even over the roar of aircraft engines and exploding ammunition. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard Taketsukaze watched in horror as his carefully trained gun crews were swept away by streams of .50 caliber fire, their bodies literally torn apart by the heavy rounds. He shouted orders to redirect fire toward the low-flying attackers, but his gunners were being killed faster than they could respond, and those who survived were too terrified to stand at their posts as the B-25s approached with their flickering noses spitting death. The Japanese Navy had never trained for this. It had never imagined that medium bombers could be turned into flying battleships bristling with forward-firing guns, and it had never developed tactics to counter an attack that combined simultaneous, high-volume strafing and bombing at wave-top height. The destroyer Arashio attempted to maneuver between the attacking aircraft and the transports, her captain bravely trying to shield the vulnerable cargo ships with his warship's hull. This heroic gesture only made her a priority target. 3 B-25s concentrated their fire on Arashio. Their combined 24 guns poured over 2,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer, turning her superstructure into twisted, unusable metal, killing everyone on her bridge, destroying her fire control systems, and leaving her rudder jammed hard to starboard. Out of control, Arashio collided with the transport Najimamaru. Both ships locked together as fires spread between them, their crews unable to separate the vessels or fight the flames effectively. Admiral Kimura, watching from his flagship as his convoy disintegrated around him, tried to comprehend the unthinkable. The attack violated every tenet of Japanese naval experience and doctrine. The Americans were not making predictable torpedo runs or dropping bombs from altitude. They were boring in at point-blank range with automatic weapons that turned his ships into instantaneous slaughterhouses. He ordered evasive maneuvers, but the B-25s were too fast and too numerous, seeming to come from every direction at once, their 8-gun noses spitting death at any ship that tried to maintain formation. The attack continued for only 15 minutes, but in that brief time, the carefully organized convoy became a scattered collection of burning, sinking wrecks. The destroyer Isagumo, trying to rescue survivors from the water, was herself attacked by 2 B-25s whose guns swept her decks clear of personnel before skip bombs blew holes in her hull below the water line. By 10:15 a.m., as the last B-25 disappeared toward the south, Admiral Kimura surveyed the devastation and realized that the Imperial Japanese Navy had just experienced a disaster that would fundamentally change naval warfare in the Pacific. Of his 8 transports, all were sinking or sunk, their burning funeral pyres marking their positions as they slipped beneath the waves, taking with them the supplies and equipment desperately needed at Lee. 4 of his 8 destroyers were gone: Sure Yuki, Asashio, Arashio, and Takatsukaze, and the surviving destroyers were all severely damaged. The human cost was staggering. Of the 6,900 troops who sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would eventually reach Lee, most rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after dark. The majority of the 51st Division was destroyed not in ground combat or by naval gunfire, but by modified bombers that turned their transports into death traps in minutes. The psychological impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy proved even greater than the physical losses. News of the convoy's annihilation spread through the fleet like a shockwave. Naval officers who had dismissed American bombing as ineffective were forced to confront the reality that the Americans had developed a weapon against which their traditional defenses were useless. The 8.50 caliber guns in each B-25's nose represented more forward-firing automatic weapons than most destroyers carried, and these weapons could be brought to bear with the speed and flexibility of aircraft. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster with visible shock, understanding immediately that Japan could no longer risk surface vessels in waters within range of American air power. The Navy's inability to protect even a heavily escorted convoy meant that reinforcement and resupply of forward positions would become almost impossible, effectively dooming Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Yamamoto ordered an immediate review, but privately conceded that there was no effective counter to the American strafer bombers. The B-25 Mitchell, a conventional medium bomber, had become the definitive ship killer, destroying an entire convoy and an